iGlobenews brings global views.
Welcome to another edition of iGlobenews, the weekly video podcast which discusses world politics and current events. My name is Diana Mountain-Markoff. I'm editor-in-chief of iGlobenews.org, and joining me again is world-renowned China expert Professor Susanne Weigel-Intrizek. Today we will discuss settling scores in the South China Sea. And for the record, today is July 16th, 2026. The South China Sea spans a region from Karimata to Malacca and the Taiwan Straits. It holds immense strategic and economic importance. Approximately one-third of global trade passes this area. It is also believed to hold a substantial reserve of oil and natural gas. The region is also rich in fisheries, providing sustenance and economic resources to the border nations, those being China, Taiwan, the Philippines, Vietnam, Brunei, Indonesia, Singapore, and Malaysia. The South China Sea dispute extends beyond maritime zones to include competing claims of sovereignty over several island groups. China claims sovereignty over the Pratas Islands, which is located 200 miles south of Hong Kong. Both Vietnam and China assert rights over the Paracel Islands, which China seized control of from Vietnam in 1974. The Scarborough Shoal, which is situated 130 miles from the Philippine coast, is contested both by China and the Philippines. In the Spratly Islands, there are overlapping claims between China and Vietnam, who both lay claim to the entire sea, whereas Malaysia, Brunei, and the Philippines claim portions of the archipelago. With all 6 countries laying claims to the maritime territory and the U.S. and Japan's involvement to counterbalance China's increasing dominance, what are the key factors driving the South China Sea crisis? How have state claims exacerbated tensions in the region? And should the world pay more attention to what is going on in the South China Sea?
Well, very interesting question, a question that nobody really takes too much notice of. While everybody is focusing on the situation in Ukraine and in Iran, it is very interesting that lots of things are happening in the South China Sea and between China and Taiwan. And it is a wonderful opportunity to get an understanding of this very complicated situation. I think we have to look at China as a growing great power. They don't speak of great power, they speak of major power. Very interesting. If you translate the Chinese word 大国 into English or whatever language, I think the normal translation would be great power. But they say major power. They're trying to be very restrained. But they are definitely not restrained when it comes to dominating the areas in front of their enormously long coastline. This is a very big issue for China, a country with a very large territory. It has 2 very difficult borders. So the one border is the coastline. It's extremely long. And in front of the coastline, you have the so-called first island chain, which goes all the way from the very north of Japan down to the Philippines. And these first island chain islands are all united in their distance to China, to be very polite. And they're leaning towards the U.S. as the dominant power in this part of the Pacific Ocean, right? So they have a long coastline, and in front of their long coastline, they have an island line which sits there and has the potential of controlling China's every move from their coast into the Pacific Ocean. And the other border, of course, is the border with Russia, which is 4,200 kilometers long and very difficult to control. If something happens in Russia, for example, a regime change, a pro-Western government in Russia, that would imply that they have this long border with a pro-Western country up north, and then they have all these countries that are pro-Western, to put it that way in front of their coastline, and they are sandwiched in between. So in order to escape from this situation, they are trying to define their access to the Pacific Ocean. And the South China Sea is like a big lake in front of the Chinese continent that they have to control in order to be able to control their access to the deep ocean. And this is the main reason why they are so extremely nervous about any move that goes against their interests. And that is why they have been comparatively rude tackling this question in relationship to the neighboring countries that you just mentioned. By the way, Taiwan also has some interests in the South China Sea. You included Taiwan in the South China Sea, that we not necessarily do, but Taiwan also has some interests with regard to the South China Sea, because some of these interests go back to an earlier historic period, which is the period of the Republic of China that was founded in 1912, and that still is existent on the island of Taiwan. And therefore, they're upholding some of the claims that the ROC government already defined back between 1945 and 1949.
Taiwan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs reiterated just a couple of days ago on July 12th the Republic of China's ROC's position, namely its 4 principles regarding the South China Sea issue, and urged all parties to strictly abide by international law and oppose unilateral expansion and actions that undermine peace in the region. And it stated, quote, ROC's Taiwan sovereignty claims and related policies regarding the South China Sea Islands have not changed. It upholds the, quote, 4 principles regarding the South China Sea. And for those who are not familiar, these 4 principles are that the South China Sea should be settled peacefully in accordance with international law and the law of the sea, including the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. Second, that Taiwan should be included in a multilateral mechanism aimed at resolving the disputes. Third, that the states concerned have an obligation to uphold the freedom of navigation and overflight in the region. And finally, fourth, disputes must be resolved through negotiations conducted on an equal basis. So, will the South China Sea issue be the area in which the Taiwan conflict escalates, in your opinion?
The Taiwan conflict is part of the South China Sea conflict, but it's also separate. And I think we have to understand that with regard to the Taiwan questions, there are 2 issues that relate the Taiwan question to the South China Sea question. First of all, if China decided to go to war against Taiwan, it is very clear that it is impossible for China to take over Taiwan if they only accessed Taiwan from the Chinese mainland. Tactically speaking, it's a very bad position for the mainland to be so close to Taiwan. For that reason, it is very easy, for example, to hit ships that tried to bring soldiers and weapons from mainland China to Taiwan. So they will have to hit Taiwan from several directions. And one of the major directions they need to use is, of course, the direction from the South China Sea. And that is also one of the reasons why China started building artificial islands in the South China Sea around the year 2013, 2014. From a military point of view, the South China Sea has a very important strategic position in the event of China going to war against Taiwan. Secondly, I would say that we can observe that whenever China is de-escalating the situation with Taiwan, it tends to escalate tensions in the South China Sea. So why is this so? It's quite interesting that the Chinese government and the Chinese military are willing and able to de-escalate the situation in Taiwan if they think that they will achieve more with regard to the fulfillments of their interests if they use diplomatic means. At the same time, while they are softer in the Taiwan question, they still have to show that they're very strong and very tough, and that they can show us that they dominate the region. These are two different aspects that they are balancing out all the time. And quite interestingly, I would say that at this moment, China has reached a certain de-escalating moment in the conversation between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, but to show that they are not weak and that they do not reach these kind of agreements with the US because they're weak, to show us that they are strong and that the US will have to stick to these kind of agreements, much in contrast to what the US did in the case of the Anchorage Agreement with Russia and the recent agreement with Iran. They are showing a lot of strength and posture in the South China Sea context. So this is how the two things are separate and related to each other. This is how I see the situation.
And recently, 14 countries and the European Union have reaffirmed their support for a 2016 international arbitration ruling that found no legal basis for China's sweeping maritime claims in the South China Sea. The statements were issued to mark a decade since the tribunal's ruling. The ruling delivered the Philippines a landmark legal victory, but Beijing has consistently reiterated its rejection, calling it, and I quote, null and void. The Philippines call the South China Sea, by the way, the West Philippine Sea. China ratified UNCLOS in 1996 and asserted its right under Article 310, which allows states to make declarations upon ratification, provided these do not alter the convention's legal provisions. For China, the South China Sea, as you have already stated, holds a very important strategic place for national security, serving as a natural defense for its southern region. It also ensures maneuverability for a strategic defense and limits U.S. military influence in the area. Historically, China views the South China Sea as integral to its territory, which dates back to the Qing dynasty, and further supported by historical maps and records. The tribunal concluded that China's claims to the so-called historic rights within the Nine-Dash Line were incompatible with UNCLOS, which stands for, by the way, UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. The world now has been totally focused on the Strait of Hormuz, understandably, because we have a hot war going on there. What goal, in your opinion, are the countries pursuing in bringing up the South China Sea arbitration ruling after 10 years and issuing their support? Is this a calculated move to poke the dragon? And what are the broader implications for international relations?
Well, I'm not a specialist in international law, but I've been following the situation since 2016. And I think it is quite interesting to see that from the Chinese side, they reject this decision on the situation in the South China Sea because, of course, it doesn't fulfill Chinese wishes, and because they have a totally different way of addressing the situation. So if we go back to the four principles that you just quoted with regards to Taiwan, I think we can understand where the differences are. So Taiwan says, of course, we have to do this by peaceful means. This is something that the PRC also underlines all the time. They don't want to do it by a military force. They want to do it by using diplomacy. Nevertheless, they are very, very active militarily in the South China Sea, both with their military and with their coast guards. So they are using a combined method. Yet another principle that Taiwan referred to is the principle of a multilateral setting. And I think this is also very interesting because China informally and historically defines the South China Sea as its sphere of influence. It rejects multilateral conclusions to the problem. So it offers bilateral talks to all the countries that are somewhat affected by the situation. And they want to come to agreements. Today, we always talk about deals. They want to come to agreements one by one. They want to talk to Vietnam, they want to talk to Malaysia, they want to talk to the Philippines and reach conclusions with them from their traditional understanding of the setting. They want all the countries that are interested in the South China Sea question, except for the US, of course, to come to a consensus that is defined by China. And China is offering them a consensus that, according to China's understanding, is a win-win situation. And we can observe this a little bit because quite recently, the Philippines ran into enormous problems regarding their oil and gas supply because of what is going on in the Strait of Hormuz. And interestingly, China offered to help them and provided them with nearly 300,000 barrels of oil to give a short-term solution to the problem. So because the Philippines, that are known to be a very, very close ally of the US, and that changed from a pro-China to a pro-US policy when President Duarte was replaced by President Marcos Jr., the Philippines suddenly had to rely on the help of China because the US was doing something in the Near East that created an enormous problem for the Philippines. The Chinese now try to use the opportunity, not only to show that they are the big power that can help the Philippines rather than making things difficult for them, but also to start talking to them to jointly exploit the oil that they are expecting to be found near the Philippine coast in waters that are usually claimed by China. How they define the win-win situation is that China is going to provide all the technical knowledge and whatever you need in order to find the oil and exploit the oil. But finally, both China and the Philippines will benefit from the situation. And this is how they try to use this opportunity now, also to show to Vietnam, to show to Malaysia, Bahrain, and all the other countries that are interested in the situation, what China understands under a win-win situation. And it is also interesting for us to really observe how far they can get with their suggestion and whether or not it is a win-win situation. It is quite clear that China rejects this arbitration because it does not go with its traditional understanding of its role in the region, which is a dominant role that is restrained insofar as it claims that it is not only to its own benefit, something we hear Mr. Trump voicing every day, is not only to their own benefit, but it's also to the benefit of the other country or the other countries.
On this past Monday, there was a round table dialogue on South China Sea security, which was held in the Hong Kong Special Administration region. And the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman, Lin Yan, not sure I pronounced his name correctly, said that China's decision not to accept or participate in the arbitration and not to accept or recognize the arbitral award is a concrete action to uphold the international rule of law and the international maritime order. And China maintains that the SCS, which is the South China Sea award, was a political farce disguised as a legal proceeding. And as you correctly said, the Philippines shifted towards China during President Duarte after 2016 and then reversed trajectory with the election of Ferdinand Marcos Jr. in 2022, and now have reaffirmed their strategic partnership with the United States. Interestingly, as you just said, now turned to China for energy. The Strait of Hormuz brought them literally in dire straits. The South China Sea arbitration ruling found that China violated the Philippines' sovereign rights by interfering with Philippine fishing and oil exploration, and by constructing all these artificial islands within the Philippines exclusive economic zone. So it's very interesting to see how you're saying how China is offering these bilateral agreements. And of course, we see this in Europe as well, where China tries to negotiate with single European countries and not with the European Union. If you're China and you're such a powerful country, major country, as you call it, major power, this is in your advantage. If you're a small country like the Philippines or even smaller like Austria, it's better to have a larger organization speaking for you. The question remains, China always likes to highlight that it stands for international law and the international rule of order and the United Nations. But then when it doesn't suit China, it reverts to these other policies. So what was the significance of the South China Sea ruling for maritime law? And how can China maintain its stand for international law and norms based on the system when it then rejects decisions that goes against its own interests?
I think it is very obvious that China is in favor of international law and the UN Charter. Whenever it's not affected, nobody should be astonished that China doesn't comply with the arbitration decision. Why this is because they have this idea that traditionally China has always been the dominant power in this region, and the countries that have interests in the South China Sea issue are countries that have traditionally had strong relationships with China, some of them being tribute states in the so-called Chinese territorial system. So from the China point of view, it is an outside force that is intruding into this situation, which is, historically speaking, a situation that is characterized by a comparatively friendly relationship between China and its neighboring countries. And who is this outside force that is interested in making things difficult? This is, of course, the US. And the fact that the Philippines, for example, during the last years allowed for 5 more military bases to be installed on Philippine islands shows that the United States also knows about the strategic importance of the South China Sea. It is a clear aim of the United States to prevent the Chinese Navy from playing a more pronounced role in the West Pacific. Whereas China wants to come to an agreement with the US that China can run the western part of the Pacific, whereas the US can run the eastern part of the Pacific. But as the world power status of the US is defined by its dominance over all world oceans, this is a no-go zone for the US.
And of course, what China has been doing, and which the tribunal also listed in its decision, is that it has been pursuing these massive land reclamations and artificial island constructions, which in addition have caused severe and irreparable harm to the fragile coral ecosystem, the whole environmental issue, which we're not discussing here, but I did want to mention it. And for more than a decade, these artificial islands in the South China Sea were viewed as a uniquely Chinese strategy for consolidating its regional maritime claims. And while Beijing's decades-long land reclamation has fundamentally altered the geography of the region, there has been a transformation underway where countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, and Taiwan have each accelerated their own land reclamation projects in occupied features across the South China Sea. And although these efforts are much smaller than China's, they suggest that opposition to the physical alteration of disputed geographies is giving way to a new regional status quo of competitive island building. The SCS ruling stated that none of the disputed high tide features in the Spratly Islands legally qualify as, quote, islands that can generate the 200 nautical mile EEZ, exclusive economic zone. China's repeated South China Sea violations were met with limited international consequences and have gradually redefined the acceptable state for the region regarding these land reclamations. So now, with many countries copying China regarding the land reclamation strategy, where does this leave the international maritime law regarding this issue? This seems to be the new vogue thing to do in the region, is to build your own little island on some rock.
If you give every country the right it should have according to international law, you will easily see that the countries are so close to each other that their interests also overlap. So this makes the situation in the South China Sea very special. It is not so easy to just apply international law and say everybody will be fine. The situation cannot be easily solved because there are still overlapping interests between not only China and the other countries, but also between those other countries. And when you look at maps where all these different countries put in their specific rights according to international law, you will see, oh, this is a whole mess. And if this is a whole mess, I think you basically have two options. One option is you go for a multilateral solution. You build an organization, you build an institution for all countries to participate. This is one way of solving the problem. This is obviously the way that what smaller countries would like. Why? Because if they can all participate in negotiations with China, they are empowered by the multilateral situation so that they can realize more of their interest than in a bilateral situation. China, of course, is interested in the bilateral situation because they have a lot of leverage and they can also play the other actors against each other. Very, very clear. So the solution to the problem, I think, cannot be to insist on international law as such, but to come to a conclusion that says, on the basis of international law, we'll have to find solutions for all those issues which cannot be solved by international law the way it is being defined at this moment. And it's quite interesting to see that China also had lots of border issues with former republics of the Soviet Union that then became independent states after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And at the time, China organized the so-called Shanghai Five organization, in which China and Russia participated, and then a number of minor countries, smaller countries, newly established countries that didn't have a lot of bargaining power. Although they had just separated from the Soviet Union and wanted to get rid of Russian dominance, they still felt more comfortable in going together with Russia into a situation where they had to negotiate their borders with China. And as a result, China has been able to solve these problems that are very, very crucial for them. And in most cases, the smaller countries were quite okay with the solution, which we can observe by this Shanghai Five organization then being transferred in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And if countries had been really unhappy about the results of the negotiations, I don't think that they would have continued to be in one organization with Russia and China. What is the reason? Why was China in a situation where it had to be comparatively benevolent towards these other countries? Because there was a second really powerful actor, Russia, in this situation. And China had to calculate that if it harms the interests of the minor actors, then these minor actors would rather go with Russia against China than with China against Russia. And I think this is a very interesting model also for the South China Sea situation. So we need someone that pushes China into restraint. And if these other countries have someone to push China into restraint, then China has to come to a conclusion that is not only good for itself, but that could also be good for the other countries and for solving those overlapping interests in a good way between the smaller countries. What is the country that could be the second pole in this situation? Japan. But because of Japan's recent policies towards China, I don't think that China would ever agree to Japan being part of this negotiation process. At the time when the Shanghai Five organization was founded, Russia was comparatively weak, but it had very, very good ties to the countries that were involved because of historical reasons and because these smaller countries thought that they needed this umbrella of Russia. In the case of Japan, I think that most countries in the South China Sea feel quite close to Japan, and Japan is not too powerful. So from that point of view, I think we could say that basically Japan would be a good second pole in this situation, and it could claim to be interested in solving the situation. But given tensions between China and Japan, I think we will have to postpone trying to make this kind of idea come true. For the smaller countries, bilateral solutions are very, very difficult to imagine. If you look at the Philippines, they are now in a situation that is somewhat similar to the situation of the Gulf states. They thought that they would be well protected against China, or in the case of the Gulf states, against Iran, if they collaborated very closely with the US and if they allowed for military bases to be in their country. Now the Philippines observe the situation in the Gulf states and realize, oh my gosh, if I one-sidedly go with the US, potentially against China, this implies that I might be in a very, very difficult situation. So maybe I use this energy problem now to give China a signal that we can talk. And then, of course, it would be much easier for China to realize its aim of talking on a bilateral basis, country by country, with those countries adjacent to the South China Sea.
So China is using the hot conflict in the Middle East region to further its own aims in the South China Sea. Very interestingly, flying under the radar, if we want to stay on the topic of Japan a little bit longer, Japan also supported this statement on the anniversary of the arbitration, and the Japanese foreign minister, Toshimitsu Motegi, issued a separate statement expressing, quote, support for the so-called arbitration. But then, according to China, Japan is using the arbitration issue as a tool to promote its military expansion and push the, quote, China threat narrative and justify a greater security role in the region by aligning with the U.S. and the Philippines under the banner of, quote, international law. According to China, Tokyo is seeking to legitimize its military transformation and deepen its involvement in international affairs. Let us also not forget that Japan's Prime Minister Takaishi and her right-wing government are actively trying to expand Japan's sphere of influence in Asia, which calls for Japan to enhance security ties with nations like Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, and export, for instance, defense equipment and holding joint exercises. Japan is investing in critical infrastructure to aid Asian Economic Development as an Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Is China correct in saying that Japan is using this issue to expand its role in Asia? But as you say, there aren't that many alternatives to including Japan as a counterpole to China if you wanted to come to a solution. Are there any other countries that could take this role?
Well, that would be really, really difficult. We should stay with Japan and Philippines for just a moment. Because Prime Minister Takaichi is trying to solve an issue of domestic politics. At the same time, she is changing her policy towards the region and the world at large. So just recently, and since 2024, it has already started in 2024, military relations between the Philippines and Japan have been growing enormously. And this is very unusual for Japan because Japan has so far played a very restrained role in military affairs. It only participated with its soldiers outside the country in case of peacekeeping activities of the United Nations. Only if there is a United Nations mandate would Japan participate in any international deployment of military forces. But recently they have come to the conclusion, for example, that Japanese soldiers could be temporarily stationed in the Philippines, which is, if I'm informed correctly, the first case since 1945 that there is, the phrase is used, military troops are being stationed temporarily in a country. So they would visit a country, they would collaborate in a certain international training with other countries, or they would participate in peacekeeping duties, but not being stationed. And the second very interesting issue here is also that Japan has been boosting its weapons technology for over a decade. And it is now a country with quite a big weapons industry. For a long time, Japan's weapons industry was somewhat restrained. I think there is still, despite a change of law that was passed in 2015, and that gives the Japanese forces a little more freedom in doing what other military and armies do. But despite this fact, they are still somewhat limited in their capacity to sell weapons to other countries. So now they lease weapons to the Philippines. They develop weapons together with the Philippines. They exchange weapons with the Philippines. So there are all these things happening between Japan and the Philippines because the Japanese government wants to be the most dominant country in this so-called first island chain. And why do they want to be the most dominant country? Because they anticipate that the US will not be able to play a major force in a confrontation with China. First of all, because the US is losing momentum, and there are many people who say that the US is a declining power. But a second consideration also needs to be kept in mind, which is that Japan very well knows that the US will be very hesitant to directly go to war against China because there's the threat of a nuclear war inherent in this situation. And as such, they calculate that the US needs someone to represent their interests in the region. And this is what Sanae Takaichi wants to do. She wants to be the most loyal and close ally of the US in the region of East Asia. And by combining forces with the US, it thinks that it can dominate the first island chain. And by dominating the first island chain, it can dominate maritime East Asia against continental East Asia, which is dominated by the People's Republic of China. And I think this is her strategy. And for that reason, she must be really, really interested in what is going on in the South China Sea. If you look at the position of the artificially built islands built by the PRC, you will see that they are also a threat to Japan as, for example, fighter planes could easily start from these artificial islands and go all the way to Japan. And it would be a much easier way to hit Japan than trying to depart from mainland China and flying towards Japan. It is very understandable that Japan sees itself threatened by the situation in the South China Sea. At the same time, with its very offensive posture, I think it is making a mistake insofar as it does not grasp this opportunity of being part of the whole process of trying to solve the situation by negotiations, because the new prime minister is taken by the idea that everybody seems to have on the Western side of the world, that is, we can only succeed if we show military strength, and we show military strength because we want to get prepared to take military means if necessary. So they're all thinking in this direction, and they are not thinking into the direction that while you're building up your military capacity, maybe you should also think about other ways of solving the problem through negotiations.
China is championing negotiations throughout the world, from the Middle East to Ukraine. It's always talking about this, that the conflicts must be settled through peaceful means and that the parties need to negotiate. And let's not forget that in November 2025, Prime Minister Takaichi stated that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would constitute a, quote, survival-threatening situation for Japan, allowing the country to deploy its military. There has been a significant policy shift signaling that Japan would defend Taiwan until the U.S. forces arrived. Donald Trump visited President Xi Jinping, who made it unequivocally clear to President Trump that if the U.S. would interfere in Taiwan, that would be considered more or less a declaration of war on China. So how likely do you see Japan coming to the aid of Taiwan? Or would the U.S. defend Taiwan, or should negotiations be the goal?
I think maybe the Japanese government is looking very closely at the situation in Ukraine. And as they adhere to the narrative that we read in the newspapers, that Ukraine is gaining momentum, that it makes the situation for President Putin very difficult in his country, that Russia is running into enormous economic difficulties. So Japan, I think, is not calculating on sending troops on the ground to Taiwan. It is maybe also not calculating on directly interfering with their missiles and other weapons by attacking China. But they think that they can take over the role that the EU has been taking over with regard to Ukraine, because they have a very well-developed weapon industry. Their weapon industry is also very well organized, as most companies that produce weapons are also are companies that are very well known for their civilian products, for example, Mitsubishi. But every worker who works in a workshop of Mitsubishi can at the same time produce civilian products as well as military. They're all trained for both things. And so Japan, because of its precarious situation, it could only produce the amount of weapons it needed itself. So it was very restrained. And for that reason, they had to develop a very flexible kind of industry that is both civilian and military, and you can change from one to the other. The workers that work on civilian products today can start working on military products tomorrow. Because of that capability, they think that they can play the role of supplying Taiwan with all kinds of weapons and other things they need in order to survive until the U.S. might interfere. I think that especially after Donald Trump's visit to Beijing, even the leadership in Taiwan, not to speak of the leadership in other countries in the region, are convinced that the probability for the U.S. to interfere into potential attack of the PRC against Taiwan is very, very low. So they think they need to build up their posture and to deter China from attacking Taiwan by making Japan bigger than it is and making China extremely nervous. We see, for example, that something happened that not so many people really were interested in Europe, but the fact that Xi Jinping traveled to North Korea is a major issue here, and it's very clear that they are coordinating their military capacities. The fact that in the recent maneuvers in the Pacific, China and Russia are cooperating very, very closely. This is not extremely new for this year, given the fact that Foreign Minister Lavrov reacted to Sanai Takaichi's statement about Taiwan by saying if Japan intrudes militarily into potential conflict between mainland China and Taiwan, Russia will be on the side of China. So also this is nothing new because it's part of their friendship and collaboration contract, but it is the first time that this was uttered in public, and it goes farther than in the past when President Putin, every time he meets Xi Jinping, he will reiterate, we support all plans China have with regard to Taiwan. So now they're saying, if Japan intrudes militarily, we will be on China's side. So there are lots of things happening in this region. But all in all, I think China is not going to be the country that goes for escalation at this particular moment. We just heard yesterday that China's economy is not doing very well. The reason is not so clear. If the Strait of Hormuz will be in a precarious situation for more months to come, then this will mean that the world will be sliding into a major crisis. And this will imply that China's economy, which heavily relies on export to countries all over the world, will be hit very, very, very badly because these exports will go down immediately. And for that reason, China at this particular moment is trying to tell the world, potentially we are very, very powerful, but temporarily we don't want to use our military power because of all kinds of reasons. I think this is the situation that China is in at this moment.
But China is flexing its muscles. So the U.S. held a major military exercise on June 27th, which was part of its biennial exercise Valiant Shield. The USS George Washington spearheaded a live firing sinking exercise known as SINKEX in the Philippine Sea, demonstrating its might and its navy. And what did China do? China deployed a warship and Coast Guard vessel over that weekend to keep tabs on the U.S. and the Philippine drills that Beijing said threatened, quote, peace and stability in the contested South China Sea. So photos were released by ABC-CBN News showing one of China's new Navy Jinkai class-guided missile frigates shadowing the drills, which included the U.S. Coast Guard vessels and Philippine Coast Guards and Navy ships. The Allied patrols took place less than 60 miles from the Scarborough Shoal, which is a rich fishing ground, which we already mentioned, for China, and which China wrested from the Philippines. The Philippines are a U.S. treaty defense ally since 2012. Last fall, China established a natural nature reserve at the shoal, sparking memories of previous Chinese civilian developments that led to full-scale military buildups at previous disputed maritime features. So what plan is China pursuing here? Obviously, it's observing very closely what the U.S. and its allies are doing. Can and will the U.S. defend any move by the Chinese in the South China Sea? And how safe are U.S. allies from Chinese aggression?
Well, I think it's very interesting that China is trying to show how powerful it is and that it dominates the region of the South China Sea. And of course, we have a reaction from the other side. So the U.S., who is the traditional dominant power in this region, including the South China Sea. The U.S. is not only dominant in the Pacific Ocean, they also know that they need to be present in those places that are the most important places in the Pacific, and the South China Sea has always been such a very important place. And for a long time, China was too weak, and especially its naval capacities were not developed enough to show the U.S. that they also had a say in this region. And now it's China pushing the U.S. out, and of course the U.S. Trying to inhibit China from doing so. So this is the situation. And although I think they are both showing whatever they can show in terms of weapons technology in order to convince the other side how powerful they are still at a level of deterrence. They're not preparing for actual war, according to my observation, but they are building up their capacities because there has been quite a lot of discussion about the fact that the U.S. Navy is not in very, very good shape. And in this situation, you, of course, fear that your adversary might use this opportunity of the Navy being very active with this blockade of Iran, and at the same time, its weapons technology not being really very much up to date. So maybe China could use this opportunity and do things that China wants to do in order to make clear that only its interests are being taken care of and not the interests of other actors in the region. As the U.S. is in a somewhat precarious situation, it is amassing all its allies, including France, for example, and the UK to participate in this military drills so that it can deploy more posture and power than it usually could if it were all by itself, or if it were only with those countries of the region that have a somewhat limited military power. It's very clear that the South China Sea at this moment is the focus of the conflict between the US and China, because when Donald Trump came to visit Xi Jinping in Beijing in May of this year, they decided that they wanted to de-escalate the Taiwan situation. Like I said at the very beginning of our conversation, now everything goes to the South China Sea and it gets really, really tense there. And one thing I have not yet explained is that for the Chinese government, this is also very important with regard to how it communicates with its own citizens. It wants to give the citizens the impression that there are outside forces that are trying to hinder China from developing into a full-fledged great power. This outside power is maybe the US. So they are threatened. Everybody has to be really careful because we are threatened. But at the same time, they also show that they have enough power to keep the US from doing any harm to Chinese interests. And by this, they build up these feelings of nationalism. They build up the feeling on the side of the citizens that the Chinese government is acting correctly, successfully, and is able to pursue its policies and reach its aims. And this is very important in China at this moment as the economy is running low. And many people inside China are unhappy about the economic situation. And being unhappy about the economic situation is something that the Chinese leadership is extremely afraid of, because they know that this can easily lead to unrest among the population, split among the elites, and things like this. They need this tension in the South China Sea very much to show their own population how powerful they are.
Some famous sayings always remain valid when we say all politics is local. It also obviously applies to China, where it wants to divert attention away from its sorry economy, which is still better than many European economies, which we discussed last time in our podcast, to unite against the common enemy, which in this case is once again, of course, the United States and its allies. But there's another organization I also wanted to bring into our discussion, namely ASEAN. And this whole South China Sea issue, or crisis, you can call it, is putting ASEAN, which stands for Association of Southeast Asian Nations, to the test. So what is ASEAN? It's a political and economic union of 11 countries. For those who do not know these countries, I repeat them: Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam, and Timor-Leste. Many of these countries overlap with the countries involved in the South China Sea issue. And of course, Japan has positioned itself as a reliable partner to help ASEAN nations avoid dependence on powers like China and also the United States. The Philippines this year, interestingly, have the chair of ASEAN and so far have not succeeded in passing a code of conduct for SCS. So ASEAN's failure to finalize the binding code of conduct for the South China Sea stems from three major roadblocks. So one, a strict consensus, a requirement in ASEAN, economic and diplomatic leverage by China, and thirdly, fundamental disagreements over the scope of and legal standing of this agreement. China, on the other hand, is pushing for, as we have already been discussing, a flexible, non-binding declaration rather than a strictly enforceable legal code that might limit its strategic actions in the region. ASEAN previously had set a 3-year deadline to complete this code of conduct by the end of 2026. It doesn't look like the Philippines are going to be able to achieve this for the reasons I just mentioned. So in your opinion, what are the chances of such a code of conduct being passed by ASEAN? Does ASEAN have a future, or would it need to be reformed? And it seems it might be running into some similar problems to what the EU is facing, which also has some unanimous decision issues when it comes to solving problems. Same issue now with ASEAN, where single member states could block such a code of conduct from coming into power.
Yeah, well, I think we first have to go back a little bit to times when ASEAN was first founded. And even though it's an organization of Southeast Asian nations, one might think that maybe Japan and China are members of this organization. They're not. So why is this so? This is because the ASEAN organization was an initiative that, to put it mildly, was strongly supported by the US. And at the time, the US neither wanted for Japan to be the dominant power in the region, nor for China. And to make sure that the US would dominate the region, they founded this organization. So it has been a long-held policy on the side of the US to prevent any regions from developing their own regional hegemon. Because according to the US assessment, which one could say, which is quite right, a regional hegemon always has the potential of challenging a global hegemon. And for that reason, they prevent regional hegemons from coming into existence. A policy that was slightly changed now with the White House national security strategy in November of 2025, where they say the regions have to solve their problems by themselves because the US cannot afford to go into every region of the world where you have conflicts and solve the problem. ASEAN originally was a pro-Western organization that was at the same time directed against China in a situation where China was mostly a political threat, not an economic threat, given the fact that in all these ASEAN countries, we have lots and lots of ethnic Chinese people who were at the time sometimes regarded as agents of the PRC government in pursuing revolution in those Southeast Asian countries that only received their independence after World War II. So they were newly established states, not very well consolidated. And the West, especially the US, were very much afraid that the People's Republic of China could ignite or support or even lead revolutions in these countries, and by this augment its influence on the region and the pro-Soviet part of the Cold War. This implies that ASEAN has a tendency of all member states to be closely allied with the US. But at the same time, for a certain time, we also had a saying which is ASEAN plus 2, which means ASEAN plus Japan and China. So the two rivals here for the region were both somewhat invited to be part of deliberations inside ASEAN. So with this move, they very cleverly started distancing themselves a little bit from US domination. They also showed that they understood that China was much more powerful today than it was in the past. But they also understood that this leverage gaining big country called China needed to be restrained by some other force that could convince China that it needed to be well behaved. Let's put it that way. And that's why when they started thinking about how can ASEAN adapt to the new situation after the end of the Cold War, they invited China and Japan to be part of it. Really interesting. So now today, when you listen to the ASEAN countries that are not unilaterally allied with the US, like, for example, the Philippines, when you hear Singapore talking about the situation, when you hear Malaysia talking about the situation, they will come up with the idea that the most important thing for the region is to avoid war. And how do we avoid war? It's by going on two legs. On the one side, we have very strong and beneficial relations with China business-wise. On the other hand, we have very strong and beneficial security relations with the US. And we preserve both. And we are not to do anything that makes China believe that we want to decouple from China. And at the same time, we don't do anything that makes the US believe that we don't need their security umbrella. So they're always balancing out these two aspects, quite different from the European Union, They're trying to balance out their relationship to those two powers that are the most prominent powers in the region, the PRC on the one side and the US on the other side. And because now this code of conduct that the Philippines wants to be accepted by ASEAN has a bias towards fulfilling too much of the interests of the US. That is why other countries say, okay, this is exactly what we don't want to do. We don't want to signal to China that we are doing something that is only in the interest for the US and which is detrimental to the interest of China. And for that reason, the Philippines have no way of doing this. And you see in this very interesting constellation that the idea that you can replace consensus by majority vote in a situation where a regional organization is built of independent nation states, the situation will become worse rather than better, because there's no way for a regional organization to always fulfill the national interests of every single nation state. You can only find compromises. But if you go from unanimous vote to majority vote, then the pressure to find a compromise will be lowered. And for that reason, internal tensions will become much more prominent. And for that reason, I hold the opinion that if we change also the EU from a unanimous vote to a majority vote in questions of external policies, I think this will be the beginning of the end of the European Union. And if we look at ASEAN, we can see that one of the reasons why they are still extant and why they are still playing quite a role in the region, maybe not in the world, is because they stick to this very delicate policy of consensus building and only letting political issues come to a unanimous decision if really everybody can comply with the decision that is to be made. For example, I mean, there are many countries that want to criticize, if not condemn, Myanmar for its policies towards national minorities, for its human rights violations, for its military dictatorial government that is not complying with any rules of democratic countries. But there are countries in ASEAN that say, no, we don't do this. This would be intruding into the internal affairs of Myanmar, and we don't do this. Also something that's very different from EU. So this ASEAN constellation is quite interestingly a very Asian situation. And I think it is really interesting to see how ASEAN says it is our aim to prevent war from happening in this region, which is not the aim of the EU, if I'm informed correctly.
Interesting parallel that you made between the EU and ASEAN and how they're dealing with similar situations in a quite different way. I wanted to now turn attention to the Strait of Malacca, which is also very important in the region. So what is the Strait of Malacca? The Strait of Malacca is a critical 550-mile long maritime gateway connecting the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea. Because this narrow channel handles roughly 25% of global trade and 80% of China's oil exports, whoever controls it and the adjoining South China Sea holds immense geopolitical leverage. And there's such a thing known among academics as the Malacca dilemma, which many consider China's strategic vulnerability. Because its economy relies so heavily on Middle Eastern and African energy shipped through the Indian Ocean through the Strait of Malacca and across the China Sea, a blockade at either choke point by a rival power, for instance, the United States, could cripple its energy supply. India uses its proximity to the strait, along with joint infrastructure developments like the naval seaport at Sabang in Indonesia, to secure its own interests and counterbalance China's naval presence in the Indian Ocean. Now, India has also weighed into the SCS arbitration ruling, referencing a, quote, rule-based maritime order. So although New Delhi did not join the U.S.-led 14-nation joint statement, it did support the legal framework for the South China Sea. So how is China dealing with this Malacca dilemma, and how does this Malacca equation into the South China Sea crisis? And is there any way to solve this so that everybody is happy?
Very difficult. First of all, I think we have to add to your interesting list of information on this issue the fact that the Strait of Malacca is only 38 kilometers wide. So this implies that this is really a choke point. And it's a choke point that for a very long period of time, nobody would speak about openly. But recently, we have been discussing this issue even before the problem of the Strait of Hormuz. Why? Because it is very clear for China that what you just told us, the US is so dominant in this region that it can close the Strait of Malacca very easily. So this implies, as we just heard, that, for example, oil and gas supply from the Near East would be interrupted and China would be in a very difficult situation. So because China knows that this is a nearly unreplaceable route through the oceans from East Asia to Europe and vice versa, it started thinking about what can we do in order to avoid that our most important rival, the US, can choke us to a point that we are no longer able to survive because of its dominance over the Strait of Malacca. And the Belt and Road Initiative is an initiative about connectivity. And it has a continental aspect and it has a maritime aspect. The maritime aspect is more the aspect of how to connect China with Africa. But the continental aspect is how to connect China with the Near East and Europe. And quite interestingly, I think we already talked about this in an earlier podcast. China's supplies for Iran now mostly go through its continental connectivity, which means its railway connections with several countries between China's far west and Iran. Recently, one of the major bridges of this railroad was destroyed, which is why the goods cannot reach down south in Iran. It kind of stops in the north. Which shows that the US and Israel had already bombarded this railway in an earlier period of the war. They know very well how important this is. If we look at Pakistan, in Pakistan, China is building the so-called Pakistan Corridor. And this Pakistan Corridor is a continental railway and a highway connection that makes it unnecessary to go through the Strait of Malacca because they can cut through Pakistan and then reach the Indian Ocean without having to go through the strait down south and then up north through the Strait of Malacca. And so for many years, we have been wondering what the hell are the Chinese doing with this Belt and Road Initiative. And at the beginning, all things we read about this initiative in China were not very helpful in understanding. And maybe they didn't really understand everything from the very beginning themselves. But now it is very, very clear that especially the continental infrastructure projects that China is building between Asia and Europe are projects to circumvent these choke points. And one of the most important choke points, of course, is the Strait of Hormuz. And it's not only a choke point for China, it's also a choke point for Japan and for other countries in Asia.
And let me also add here, it's been a very interesting suggestion by Indonesia's finance minister that Jakarta is considering extracting tolls from the Strait of Malacca. And this, of course, set off much concern across Southeast Asia, including officials from Singapore. There are 4 ASEAN states, namely Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand, who jointly manage what is known as Malacca Strait Patrol, MSP, to ensure that the narrow passage remains open to trade. And we already just mentioned that nearly a quarter of global seaborne trade goes through this strait. The arrangement of this MSP benefits all parties as well as the global economy. Without this institution, the Malacca Strait would just be as vulnerable as maybe the Strait of Hormuz. So as my final question today, could this model, which is now installed in the Strait of Malacca, be a model for solving the Strait of Hormuz. For instance, you could set up a group of states, maybe Iran, Oman, and the UAE, to manage the strait and maybe even extract tolls or at least also ensure safety for the passage. Could this be a viable model which the world could be looking to?
I think this model sounds very rational, and maybe in 20 years from now, it won't be a problem to build such a model and make it work very well, including a toll that ships would have to pay, not the way Donald Trump said it's 20% of the worth of what they load on the ship, but like Iran says, $1 per barrel. This is a little bit more realistic. That everything was open so far is due to the fact that the US said we are controlling everything. And even though you are right to say that these ASEAN countries are de facto controlling the Strait of Malacca, and there are all kinds of things that you need to do in order to safely go through this passage. It is these four countries you just mentioned that have the right and duty to enforce all these different provisions, as they are spending quite a lot of money. By doing this, it is understandable that they want to earn a little bit more than they earn already. When ships have to wait for the passage, they already have to pay and things like this. So it's not that they are always providing public goods without generating any kind of income. This is not right, but they could generate more income. And the fact that they have so far not generated more income is due to the fact that the US was the most dominant power in this region. And now you see that the US is losing in dominance because of what is going on in the Strait of Hormuz. And immediately, those countries that so far needed to restrain themselves from asking for more tolls come up with the idea, we want more tolls. Very interestingly. So by the reaction of these so-called minor actors in the system of international relations, you can slowly but steadily assess to which degree U.S. power in the region is in the process of declining. And why it is declining, some people say principally because the US is a major power and it will decline sooner or later. Leaving this aside, looking very realistically at the situation, you see that beginning with the war in Iran, things have changed in this region enormously. And although the US is telling us that they can enforce everything on Iran, those minor players in the region seem to have a different perception of the situation. And of course, they look at the situation in the Strait of Hormuz and they say, okay, why don't we learn from that? So this is the reason why, at this particular moment, Iran cannot share its responsibility for the Strait of Hormuz with other countries in the region. First of all, because other countries in the region, some of them are very closely aligned with the US, which is, of course, something that is not good in the eyes of the Iran government. And secondly, because as we see, if the US continues bombarding Iran, attacking Iran, the most important thing they hold in the hand is their power over the Strait of Hormuz, which is something that the US side identified as a choke point immediately. And now we have this back and forth with the US claiming that they dominate the situation, and then Iran saying, no, this is fake news. We are dominating the situation. And if a certain vessel doesn't behave according to the rules and regulation that Iran is trying to make them comply with, then Iran can attack them, and things go back and forth. The same situation is, to a certain degree, also true for Malacca. Although the Strait of Malacca is a little bit different situation, theoretically speaking, you could avoid going through the Strait of Malacca, but this is very dangerous. Many ships encounter terribly dangerous situations if they try to circumvent the Strait of Malacca. And for that reason, they can do this, but it is too dangerous to avoid the Strait to Malacca unless you are forced to do so. And then secondly, we have 4 countries that have always been collaborating in ruling this situation. The fact that they have been collaborating is a clear consequence of US dominance. So if US dominance goes down, then the conflict of interest will also arise among these four countries, unless ASEAN will find a way to convince them that collaboration is better than conflict. We will have to realistically assess the situation with regard to these choke points as being in the process of change. We will have to face the fact that more and more tolls are going to be asked for if these passages want to be safe enough for insurances to insure the vessels that go through these choke points.
Which will make products, of course, more expensive for everyone around the world. So every single person is affected by decisions politicians make halfway across the world regarding something where many people say, oh, that doesn't affect me. We know now that in such an interconnected world, every decision affects, at the end of the day, everyone else, everywhere.
Yeah. And you know what? The fact that we are so interconnected is still one of the reasons why we don't have more wars than we already have. On the one hand, it seems very rational for national governments to come to the conclusion that they have to reduce their international entanglement with regard to supply chains and things like this. On the other hand, we have to keep in mind that if they reduce their reliance on other countries, this also implies that you can risk a war more easily than in a situation where you are so much entangled. And one of the reasons why the People's Republic of China is so peaceful at this moment is because they are so entangled internationally that for them, going to war would be very much detrimental to their economic interests. And as we reiterated time and again, their economic interest is enormously important for the stability of the CCP regime in China. So this is one of the reasons why China is so nice.
I guess we could have a whole discussion whether China really is so nice.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Yeah.
Is China nice?
Is China nice? Yeah. Yeah, let's have a discussion about this. This is really an interesting topic because many people think that China is nice. Not necessarily me, but there are many people around the world who think that China is at least the nicest among the three nuclear powers, which, comparatively speaking, is a right thing to say because China is the only country among the three that is not at war with another country at this particular moment. So from this point of view, one needs to agree to this assessment. Yeah.
Okay. I've noted that. Is China nice?
Okay.
I like that. Well, Suzanne, thank you. It was a really very, very interesting discussion. I think we touched upon lots of points and showed how interconnected our world is again, and that one cannot only look at one little place, one has to look halfway around the world at another area to give you impetus maybe at how to solve a conflict. And I think this discussion might hopefully give some decision makers some ideas.
Thank you. I think you provided a wonderful opportunity to speak about a region of the world that is not in the focus of our attention at this moment. But I hope that our conversation could show us that very often, while things seem to be moving very quickly in one part of the world and nothing is happening in other parts of the world, this is only true because we tend to overlook. And of course, politicians in Asia are now using the situation of us being focused on Europe and the Near East to settle some of the issues or unsettle them and making things difficult or less difficult. So it's very important to look at East Asia, and East Asia is one of the major regions in the world that is going to have an impact on our lives for the next years to come. And for that reason, thank you very much for providing this opportunity.
Thank you, Suzanne. And for our listeners, thank you for tuning in to another session of iGlobenews. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. And thank you for being loyal followers of our podcast.